Welcome into another episode of Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter. I am Paul Gallant, and this time I have the pleasure of being joined by Jeff Simmons of Real Hawk Talk with our friends Hawk blogger Evan Hill, both of whom who have been on this show before. Jeff, how you doing, man?
I'm all right. I don't know if I can top Evan Hill, but
can anyone top Evan Hill?
No.
The takes are too hot.
Yeah, he's actually a pretty nice guy off the air. Like, he's a much calmer. When he was on your show, you actually had him pretty good, but like his Twitter personality is nuts.
His Twitter personality is something else, but I think that's what makes this entire show so fun. We get to see who's actually behind these tweets, and he is such a sweet guy. You are right. So the big news today, Tyler Lockett signs an extension. It's, if you look at the totality of the deal, which the agents always want out, $69 million. Looks like it's probably a 2-year deal. It gives the Seahawks some flexibility to finagle some cap room. And I think most importantly of all, Jeff, it means that Tyler Lockett's not going anywhere at the end of this season.
Yeah, I think what you said is perfect. The numbers looked a little big, so the agent was doing a good job there.
Mm-hmm.
And $17 million a year was like, that's a little much for Lockett. But I think when we see the real numbers, it'll look a lot different. His cap number this year was supposed to be right around $15 million. And when you looked at their cap table, it's like, this doesn't work. So there was a lot of people who thought, well, maybe they'll trade Tyler Lockett. But then you're like, well, they don't have a third receiver, so they're not going to do that. So they have to lower his cap number. The only way to do that, he's not going to take a pay cut, was the extension. So like you said, one of the strengths of this team is that receiving core. They needed to bring him back. And once you see the real numbers, it'll look a lot different. And for the most part, it just looks like a market value deal. It's not one of these steals. It's not one of these, wow, John Schneider did it again. It seemed to be they paid him a fair deal for like a 12th, 13th best receiver in the league.
Yeah, that's about where he is. And you combine him with DK Metcalf, and I know that he ranks differently for a lot of different people. Some people love everything that he brings to the table. Other people are like, hey, the hands need to be a little bit better. But Russell Wilson's now got arguably the best 1-2 wide receiver tandem in the NFL, not for this just coming season, but for a couple of seasons, assuming, of course, that they give DK Metcalf an extension. My hope is that this is continuing to go a long way towards making Russell Wilson feel like he is being given every single weapon possible so that he can do what he wants to do and, of course, help this team win.
Yeah, Lockett's one of Russell's best friends on the team. The two of them were super close. I remember when those SI stories came out a couple years ago, they're like, well, we're not as close to Russell as Lockett is. So Lockett is one of his best friends on the team. The two of them work really well together because of how good Russell's deep ball is. And that's Lockett's game, getting behind, getting vertical, getting behind. And I think he can even be better on out of the slot, shorter routes. So yeah, like I said before, having the combination of DK and Lockett is one of the roster strengths of this team. And having these two secured for the foreseeable future has to go a long way for Russell. The two of them are close. They work really well in the field, and Russell is now celebrating all of the Seahawks moves on Twitter. So
yes,
it seems like his tone has changed a lot.
I know. There's a part of me that wishes, Jeff, that he would acknowledge that the last 5-6 weeks were a tad turbulent for all of us, seeing as we all were like, what's going on every single day? There was blood in these Seahawks Twitter streets. Where do you stand on that? Because it does feel as if the fan base is quite divided. Always really has been. There always seems to be a camp Pete Carroll, a camp Russell Wilson. I empathize with some of Russ's concerns, but at the same time, I'm annoyed by it. I think I lean more with Pete Carroll on some of them. I guess, where do you fall?
Yeah, my initial response, and I think I tweeted this out, was, okay, Mark Rodgers is doing this again. And I know your co-hosts and other people like to talk about Mark Rodgers. John Clayton loves to talk about Mark Rodgers. So that was my initial response. And like you, I emphasize with what Russell is saying because he's not wrong. Everything he's saying about the offensive line, and him and Pete have always sort of been a weird fit in a lot of ways. It was kind of weird how he handled it and the trade teams. And when I looked at that trade list, I remember being like, this doesn't make any sense at all.
Right.
Why I keep coming back to Mark Rodgers. I'm like, was he trolling them? Like, it's hard to see because Chicago, the whole time, everyone was like, Colin Cowherd said this and Florio said this. And I'm like, there's no match here. You can give all their first round picks and all their overpaid defensive players. Where's the path to a quarterback? So I was always like, they don't work either. So I was always like, well, I don't see a way once Miami's not on the list or the Jets, I didn't see a way there's a match because there's no path to getting your next quarterback. So my view was, okay, I think they'll just end up sort of where they are now. I didn't think free agency would go as good as it did from the Seahawks perspective. They've done a lot more than I would have imagined. And I thought it was going to be a lot uglier of a situation going into the season. And my view was always like, okay, let's see what happens this year with Waldron. Let's see where things go. And maybe next year where the cap number's lower and maybe if it happens again, he expands that list. So I was always like, there's no way he's getting traded now. It's a lot of talk, but that's sort of where we are.
Gabe Jackson's probably the headliner. And I think that has to do with the fact that it seems that the offensive line is the thing that Russell Wilson was most concerned with. I don't know what to make of Gabe Jackson. Now, we had him on our show this morning, and he's a funny individual. They, of course, announced yesterday that he had signed a bit of an extension, which is great because a $9 million cap hit for a guy that the Raiders were going to cut for reasons I still don't understand. I don't know what the Raiders are doing right now. They just moved on from like their entire offensive line in one off season. It's easy to point at John Gruden and Mike Mayock and say like they're just foolish, but at the same time, I mean, they can't be that dumb, right? I mean, they've been hanging around NFL circles for such a long period of time, specifically Gruden. But what do you make of the Seahawks bringing in Gabe Jackson? Because while I am excited that they clearly upgraded at left guard, just given that Mike Iupati looked like he wasn't able to be a starter last season, he just happened to be the starter. He's got to be an upgrade, but I just wonder how much of an upgrade, especially in a division that's got Aaron Donald and Nick Bosa and some of the other, now J.J. Watt.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you. I think from an ideal standpoint, I was hoping they would go get Corey Linsley, the center from Green Bay, or I always thought Thuney was going to be priced out for them. And I never saw him. And then the guy they really wanted was Kevin Zeitler. He was Russell's teammate in college, and they actually offered more money than Baltimore did. He didn't end up coming here. So when you looked at the market and once Zeitler went off and once Thuney went off, Gabe Jackson made sense for them because he was a guy who can upgrade. I don't think he's going to like change the ceiling of their team, but Mike Iupati in the first 5 games last year was really good. And once his body started to break down, it just became a disaster spot for them. So having a capable, professional, good pass protecting left guard to me it's a big deal. Again, yeah, you would have liked to see like a needle moving player, a guy who can really be like a long-term piece here. They don't have Dwayne Brown's their best player, but he's nearing the end of his career. It's 35.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good move. I don't think it's like a game changing, but I think for where this team was, if you didn't get Gabe Jackson and you're left in this offseason where there's no guards left, they don't have a lot of draft picks, and that story is just circling around the team. Well, they didn't get Russell, the offensive lineman he wanted, and that story would not have gone away. You guys know that better than anyone.
Oh.
So I think from that perspective, it was a huge move because it sort of cleared the air on the narrative around them. And Russell, based on what Gabe said, Russell seemed pretty happy about it. So from that perspective, I think it was a really important decision.
I'm with you there. We'll see what he's able to bring to the table. He's the headliner. The rest of the free agency moves you see on defense, some ex-49ers, Kerry Hyder, Ahkello Witherspoon. You bring Al Woods back into the mix after a year away from the NFL. Some old man strength at defensive tackle. We'll get to some of the guys that they moved on from Jarran Reed in just a moment. And you bring in Gerald Everett from Shane Waldron's offense. Of all those other guys, who is most intriguing to you?
Probably Everett. And I think, one of the things with this team is once the last couple of years when Tyler Lockett got injured and teams start scheming away the deep ball, they had no counterpunch. And that might have been a Schottenheimer thing. That might have been a Russell thing. Some of the film nerds on Twitter will be like, well, Russell misses open guys all the time. The thing I like about Everett is he complements the other guys well in terms of he's more of like a yards after catch, seam player, middle of the field guy. I still think they missed that. They really missed sort of what Doug used to bring and sort of back in the day with Seattle, a Bobby Ingram type, where like someone who can get open on third down. And the way they play, like Pete puts such an emphasis on third down. So I think Everett really fits in terms of like what a second tight end does for the scheme they're playing this year. They don't really have a yards after catch guy. I think they were one of the last teams in the league last year in that. And I think Everett, his contract ended up being pretty low. I think it ended up being $4 million for this year. So I think the upside of that play, I don't think Everett's going to come in and get like 900 yards, put up Jimmy Graham's stats. I think he'll be fine as the third passing option. Some of the other defensive guys do intrigue me. It's at the numbers they got them at. But to me, Everett has the highest ceiling of any of the players they added.
Everett plus Shane Waldron, who worked with him before. Yeah, I'm intrigued. And I really want to see what Shane Waldron does and how different this offense is going to look. Because you mentioned a little bit ago, my theory as to why the offense hit the wall the way that it did was partly on Russ, partly on the offensive line, partly a bunch of other factors too. But I thought for the most part, if you can't beat the same defense over and over and over again, then there's probably something wrong with the actual scheming, no matter how Russell Wilson might have felt about Brian Schottenheimer. I didn't think that was Pete Carroll's fault necessarily. So I wonder, what kind of offense is Shane Waldron going to bring in? I think conventional wisdom says that it would be some variant of what we have seen out of LA over the last couple of seasons. But I remember during his opening press conference and during his conversation with us, it seems as if that's not necessarily the case. I don't know what to expect, but I would like to see more tight end involvement. It's been frustrating the last couple of years because of the injuries to Will Dissly. And just last year, Greg Olsen was not, I think, the kind of player that Russell Wilson probably advertised to the Seahawks he still could be.
Yeah, and I think when he was on your show, he was really reserved. You were doing a good job trying to get something out of him.
Thank you.
He's been trained. I don't know if it was McVay. He was good. So, yeah, it's the biggest wild card of the season, what this offense is going to look like. The natural thought, and everyone's like, okay, they're just bringing Sean McVay's offense here. We don't know that. He's never been a play caller. We don't know how much Pete's going to be involved. We know they want to run. I know they seem to have some similar philosophies, which is why I think he was the compromise hire. So to me, yeah, you hope there's a sort of a McVay sense in terms of there's more. I know what Jake Heap says a lot. There's more layups in the offense. I think that's important. I think things have gone in hard on Russell, and if that deep ball's not there, there's not a lot of easy throws. And I know some people will argue against that and say, well, they were open, he just didn't hit them. But I think like just clearly defined reads and more of a horizontal game. They were very good vertically. I think that was Schottenheimer's strength, was the vertical game. I think that's where he comes from. But once that, like the Rams start taking that away and teams sort of got the book on that, they really had nothing. They had no counterpunch. So I'm very curious if Waldron can bring in more of the horizontal game that gives them the full range of the field, because they've been, obviously, how good Russell is at the deep ball, how good those two receivers are getting deep, but that third part of the field has just not been utilized. And they relied on Jacob Hollister a lot, and Hollister maximized what he was. I'm not a fan of Jacob Hollister as a player. He drove me crazy. He can never break a tackle, but he was fine. But like, he was their third target in a lot of games. And to me, that was just really limiting. I just picture like playoff games where you're relying on Hollister on third down. And I think like an easy throw to a tight end to me can open up a lot of this offense.
Whether it's Everett or Dissly, yeah. And we'll see. Dissly coming off of that injury, maybe he's, this is the first time that no catastrophic season-ending injury. Thank goodness for him. I feel bad. He's a funny guy, too, on top of all of that. And you just want to see a personality like that get a chance to continue to play, get a little more notoriety. I wonder what they do at wide receiver 3. David Moore goes to the Carolina Panthers. David Moore was a weird player because there would be some moments where you're like, wow. I mean, he's got side-to-side wiggle, he can jump high, he can make incredible catches, but it was so inconsistent and sporadic. And I like the limited action I saw out of Freddie Swain, but I don't know that I want to pen him in at wide receiver number 3 yet. Part of me thinks, Jeff, that maybe that second-round pick is where you target a wide receiver in a supposedly loaded wide receiver class that, I'll be honest, I have not studied at all yet. I'm waiting a week or so to get into all the draft talk.
Yeah, I'm with you. David Moore is he's an all or nothing player. You described them perfectly. He's the kind of guy who would drive me nuts because I don't know why I picture he's the kind of guy when you need 8 yards, he'll run out of bounds at 7 yards away. But on the next play, he'll catch a ball over someone's head on 4th and 10. And he would make incredible plays, but it just down to down, he was not consistent enough. And like I said before, they sort of need a third receiver. I think if someone gets injured, right now Freddie Swain has to start. So that's a little scary. If DK gets banged up and you got to start Lockett and Swain, it's not great.
Nope.
So you look at free agency a couple of weeks ago, there was a pretty good list. There's 12 guys available. Now there's 2. and it's Golden Tate, and he's 33. I don't know how much he has left. He's got an odd relationship with the team. And
sure he does.
And then there's Antonio Brown, who,
I know, but he is available.
Russell really wants, and they went after him last year. And I keep wondering, he's not signed by Tampa, and Tampa brought everyone back. So if they had more picks, I would be confident that the draft would be the way to go. And I think this is a reflection of the mistake they made last year by not picking a receiver high in that draft class, where there was the second round was like all hits.
Yeah.
It was like Pittman and Claypool and KJ Hamler and T. Higgins. All these guys were hits. Denzel Mims, who the Jets got with their pick, they used to trade up. All these guys. And then now all of a sudden you have more flexibility with Lockett, and your roster's deeper. And it's a similar class this year, but they have some big needs, corner and center. And so ideally, the second round pick would be, there's some receivers that you can put in as the slot guy, I think would be great. But I keep wondering about Antonio Brown. I don't like it at all, but I keep coming back to that and thinking the longer he's out there and there's draft capital remains this low, I don't know.
And it sounds like there actually was interest last year to the point of they made an offer and the Bucs, he just picked the Bucs.
Yeah.
Now I'm looking at the way that Bruce Arians has been talking about Brown over the past week or so. He doesn't seem that excited about the idea of Brown. I don't know if he's trying to help out Tampa Bay, who has obviously made a lot of re-signings this offseason, try to keep things as cheap as possible. But that he is hanging out there, it has me a little concerned. The other thing is, too, I mean, while I think he's despicable off the field, as far as teammates go, he wasn't the worst. He wasn't getting mad over only getting 17 targets in a game like he did that one time. It came against, I think, the Kansas City Chiefs with Pittsburgh. Man, that guy is something else. Fascinating wide receiver diva. So that's an option. It's a bummer because with the restructures that they just did with Lockett, with Jackson, you would think that they would have a little extra to spend on something new. Maybe that extra is going to be used to bring back KJ Wright or Quinton Dunbar, though I'm getting a little skeptical of that because there's actually teams that seem to be interested in him, Lions, Cardinals. I don't know if the Seahawks are going to get in a bidding war over him. But I wonder now what they do with this extra money and if it's something that means that they're going to wait until after June or maybe into August as far as just hoping that somebody ends up getting clipped. And they're like, oh, hey, look at that. Falls right into our lap.
Yeah, I think KJ Wright is someone they can do. I'm not sure that's the best decision, and I really like KJ, but I don't know if you want to have that much money into the linebacker position when you drafted a guy in the first round last year. Bobby is at the top of the scale, $18 million. I love Bobby, but I don't know if he's worth $18 million in 2021.
I don't think he is, right?
Yeah, I don't think he is either. And so if they want to play Brooks, who by all indications looked pretty good at the end of last year, I think that might be a little of an emotional move by the Seahawks rather than a logical one. I wonder about Richard Sherman.
I do too. Man, there's so many old names that could end up coming back in. We already saw Al Woods. You mentioned Golden Tate earlier.
Yeah, I wonder about him. His market probably didn't play out the way he thought. He's 33. He's injured. I'm sure he's a little more selective than someone else. And like Xavier Rhodes got $6.5 million. He's a little younger than Sherman. He had a better year than Sherman last year. I wonder if that could happen. Dunbar's a guy who's going to visit. I'm sure teams want to check out because he couldn't move last year. Like that Buffalo game was one of the worst games I've ever seen corner play. He like literally couldn't move.
Yeah. Everyone highlights Jamal Adams in that game, but it's like, no, that was one of Dunbar's worst performances. And after that, I think Pete Carroll was like, yikes, he can't move. Yeah. And I'm not sure that he is playing the defense correct either because he was playing not so well as far as the actual sounded. I think Danny described it as, I forget what if he was playing too tight. I think he was playing too soft and people.
Yeah, there was massive cushion, which means you knew he was hurt and he couldn't keep up with guys. I just remember like they couldn't defend a basic comeback route, and the other team knew it.
It's interesting that's that time of the year with the defense and how bad it looked, and then what it looked like at the end of the year. What do you think this defense is? I'm still trying to figure that out myself because part of me thinks that they did make some strides down the stretch. Carlos Dunlap's addition helped the pass rush change from being one of the league's worst to at the very least being competent. But there's another part of me that keeps saying to myself, Paul, you got to be realistic here. They went up against banged up Kyler Murray with a messed up shoulder. They had 3 games against Jared Goff. They had Dwayne Haskins and Colt McCoy as other quarterbacks that they went up against. But there were seemingly some strides made on that side of the ball. I don't think they're maybe next year as bad as they were in the first half of the season, which was historically bad. But where are they? That's a really difficult place to put them between a defense that's beating up on these, let's be honest, not very good quarterbacks, and then a defense that's historically like one of the worst of all time.
Yeah, they had one of the weirdest seasons I think I've ever seen, where both sides of the ball just had their extremes just totally flipped. I don't know if I can ever remember a team that went from being the best offense in the league to broken on offense, and defense were statistically one of the worst all time. They were pretty good. But yeah, the little meatball is like, yeah, they didn't really play anyone. I think their defensive line is going to be pretty good. I think they really did well to add depth. I think even though they've lost some guys there, I think that group, you're pretty comfortable. I think the linebacker, you'd like to see them add another body because Cody Barton has looked pretty scary when he plays. He does not look like a starting player. Their safeties are good.
Yes.
Like Quandre Diggs really came on in the second half of last year. He was really good in that deep safety role. I think DJ Reed played really well last year, but again, you don't know.
Right.
I think that corner one is just such a question mark. I don't know if that's Witherspoon or is it Flowers? Like
definitely not Flowers.
I'm not a Flowers guy. I was not. So until they kind of add bodies there, I'm a little on the skeptical side. So I think their front seven will be pretty good, but who's covering number 1 receivers? Is it Witherspoon? Like,
yeah.
I saw Sherman say that like he thinks Witherspoon will be good in this defense.
I think he will too. I mean, I went back to some early articles that were written about him in 2019. They were coming from the San Francisco side of things. They were, I think, a little bit effusive and over the top in the praise that they were giving him. But there was at least one guy who thought that he was the best corner on the team the first 2 weeks of the season. Like he was better than Richard Sherman. He had a really good game against Mike Evans. Then he gets banged up and he comes back and he was a disaster. And I guess he lost his confidence. And as someone who is, we've both seen what happens with a cornerback who struggles with confidence in Trey Flowers. I think that's one of the reasons you can't really trust Trey Flowers as a starter. I don't mind him as a backup. Keep him under contract as long as you can. But you need to have somebody who can consistently get over the mistakes that are made out there. And Witherspoon has all, I think, the measurables that you want. But that side of it seems like is the one question mark. And then you mentioned DJ Reed. I think that guy's awesome. But there's the size element, and then there's a who did they go up against in the second half of the year as well element too.
He covered Terry McLaurin really well. That was his best game, that Washington game. But again, Dwayne Haskins.
Yeah, he stinks.
So you gotta be realistic. Yeah, Witherspoon's got like crazy upside. Like he could be as good as Shaq Griffin was last year at a third of the price. So to me, that was a good buy. It was a good roll the dice. He fits the scheme. He shut down DK Metcalf in week 17.
I like his hands. I'm not going to act like I'm some mensa when it comes to studying defensive backs, but I think he does a really good job based off of the highlights that I watch of him for the most part, of putting his hands in at the right time, knocking in the way footballs, or just reaching for a strip. So that's interesting at the very least. But is that gonna be better than Shaquille Griffin? And I wonder about that. Griffin, I mean, he got paid a lot. That is a classic Jacksonville Jaguars move. Let's pay a lot for a cornerback that, we'll see how that guy ends up being. I think back to A.J. Boye, who I covered in Houston, who I thought was going to be a really good player. I thought the Texans made a mistake letting him walk. He goes there, he has like one decent season, but when that defense started to fall apart, he started getting called for flags, for penalties all the time. And then you're like, oh yeah, well, probably the Texans made a correct decision here, surprisingly.
Yeah, to me, the biggest mistake the Seahawks would have made this offseason, and we talked about it in our show a ton, was that, and a lot of people took it like, we hate Shaq Griffin. No, he was a capable, above average to good starter. But to me, when they were pretty limited going into this off, paying like a guy top flight money is the thing that can kill you in a salary cap. And you saw they've had to admit the mistake with Jarran Reed.
Yeah. Where
a year after paying him almost elite money, they had to pull the plug on it. And to me, that was the biggest mistake Seattle. And Seattle got into the top final 3 on there. So this could have been a very different tone. To me, Jacksonville paying him like $14, $15 million. That's the kind of deal you're going to look back in 2 years and just be like, that's a bad signing.
Yeah.
And you can't pay average players elite money. And I think that's where teams get killed in free agency. And it's why Miami has been the same way for 10 years. And that just seems like an obvious mistake. And if Seattle did that, their whole offseason would have been different. They would not have been able to do all these things.
Definitely. Right. Or there'd be a bunch of restructures and all of a sudden they're like the New Orleans Saints who were somehow $100 million over the cap. By the way, it doesn't seem like that hurt them that bad. So I'm wondering, like, are they cooking their books? And same thing I wonder with the Rams and Les Snead too. Like, how the hell are they affording all of these guys? It makes no sense.
No, I don't get it. Every year I'm like, this is the year of the Rams. It's all going to catch up to them. Like they've traded all their first away. Like it started to chip away the last 2 years. And then they find a way to get rid of Jared Goff. Which, by the way, I think I still can't get over the Lions making that trade. Like, it's been driving me nuts. Like, as a Seahawks fan, not only has it really helped the Rams, Carolina offered them, like, the 8th pick in the draft. They would have had the 7th and the 8th pick, and they could have got, like, Teddy Bridgewater, I think, who's the same as Jared Goff. That trade.
That's what I wonder about, too. But my take on it was, so it's the 8th overall pick. You're not going to get one of those quarterbacks. I mean, shoot, if San Francisco's trading up to get the 3rd pick at quarterback, and we'll get to San Francisco in a bit, all right, so you might have a shot at the 5th best quarterback or the 4th best quarterback if you're lucky and Kyle Pitts ends up getting drafted, the wide receiver, or excuse me, the tight end out of Florida, and the tackle, I think they're out of Oregon, who's supposedly at the top of the board. I forget his name off the top of my head. But when you decide to trade up to 8, okay, great. But I don't know that you're as close to getting that kind of transcendent player there as you might be if you're a couple of picks higher. So I kind of get why Detroit decided, hey, let's go with all the first round picks. Let's hope that the Rams just completely faceplant so that maybe
if
we
that
can.
Happens, it's a great trade.
Right. And that's what I'm wondering. If it's like one of those things like you saw in the NBA with Boston and the Nets back in the day where you think, oh, yeah, the Nets are going to be great for a while. And then all those guys end up being old men in wheelchairs and it didn't really work out so well for Brooklyn. But that one is interesting. How much better do you think the Rams are with Stafford over Goff? Because there's something about Stafford which bothers me. I don't like being told someone's good. And I don't get to watch a whole lot of Matt Stafford, so I would be lying if I said, like, oh, this guy's overrated or anything like that. But whenever someone tells me that I need to respect this quarterback and all that he's been able to do, I respect his toughness. I mean, the dude broke his back like twice in the last 3 years, and he played through the first one. But at the same time, is he going to be that much better than Jared Goff? Is Goff that terrible? Is Stafford that underrated?
Yeah, I'm sort of with you on that. Like, I think Stafford is pretty significantly better than Goff, but I still look at their roster. I still see a very top-heavy team. I don't think they're going to all of a sudden jump to like a fringe playoff team, the Super Bowl contender. And I think all those moves and all those shortcuts, they add up. And the Seahawks will eventually see it with the Jamal Adams trade, and you saw it with some other moves and their drafting. And I think they'll be better. I think right now on paper, they are probably the favorite in the West, but I don't think they're instantly Super Bowl contenders. I don't think they're better than Tampa. So I still need to see it. I'm with you. Like, all you hear about is, okay, Stafford can make all these throws, but he's never won a playoff game. And I know that's not the best way to judge a quarterback, but he's never really been in big games in the NFL.
Yeah.
So I need to see it. I'm with you. I think they'll be better.
Like, I agree.
Yeah.
And I think the weird game of rock, paper, scissors in the NFC West where the 49ers own the Rams own the Seahawks, and the Seahawks own the 49ers. And then I described the Cardinals as the kids at the kid table eating Play-Doh. Like they're just off to the side.
I think the hardest thing in the NFL is that everything's meant to bring you down. So it's easy to like go up at first to become great. And we saw it with the Seahawks and the Rams. You saw it 2017, 2018. They were probably the best roster in the NFL those years. And what happened was the NFL does its thing and they took some shortcuts and it brings you down to good. And we've seen it with the Seahawks. They've won one playoff game the last 4 years. Once you kind of do that drop in Green Bay and Pittsburgh are sort of there too, to go back to great is really, really hard in this league once you pay your quarterback. And you look at all these teams and the Rams are in that boat and they think this move is going to bring them back to great. I don't know if it will.
I'm with you there. I think it puts them in the driver's seat for the NFC West, assuming that we don't see whoever's under center for San Francisco this coming season, their future quarterback. But at the same time, too, I look at San Francisco and I wonder, just because of the depth of their roster, if they still would have the leg up on this Rams team that for whatever reason, even when they had everyone on the injured reserve this past season, they're still able to beat them 2 times. What did you make of that move? Trading up to the number 3 spot. I'm not sure who they're going to go after. I know that there's been some people saying Mac Jones, other people say Justin Fields, other people say Trey Lance. I honestly don't know what to say about it. I do think that they are making less of a risk than the Rams, because I think the Rams are trading for a guy. We'll see what Matt Stafford's able to bring to the table, but I feel like it's a little riskier to trade for a guy that's had the injuries that Stafford's had the last 3 years compared to trading for a guy that you don't really know who it is, even if it's the 3rd best option in the draft, which is to say, both of these teams are making really big risks this offseason and offseason after the Seahawks went all in on Jamal Adams.
Yeah. Yeah, that trade doesn't look great when those 2 first rounds are going for quarterbacks. I still wonder, if they actually just shot that package to every team in the league, okay, we're going to give 2 firsts and a 3rd out, what they could have gotten. There's no way that would ever happen, but the answer would have been definitely a better package than what they got.
Yeah.
But back to your original question, I'm with you. I really think, if you project out beyond this year even, I think the Niners are by far the best team set up. And sort of what I mentioned before with the good to great thing, I think going back to a quarterback on the rookie scale, I think that really allows them. And they got Ayuk and Samuel on rookie contracts and Bosa on a rookie contract. And so that really sets up where they can add players to their team, where the Rams are going to be pretty limited the next couple of years. This is they've taken on so much dead money. They don't have 1st round picks. This is sort of their team. So I think the Niners ceiling, and even if you look at the Seahawks, they have a lot of unsigned contracts beyond this year. So it's sort of hard and the whole Russell Wilson thing, it's so hard to project what they'll be in 2022. So I think San Francisco is definitely best set up for the future. I like the move there. They're in a position where they might not ever get back to that pick in the draft again.
Right.
They probably looked at this is a 5 quarterback draft, and they say, okay, this is our chance. Let's go for it. So I like the move. There's a lot of Mac Jones talk. I'm not deep enough into the quarterbacks. I obviously haven't been studying that. So I don't know yet, but if they hit on that pick, I'm hoping they blow it, obviously, but if they hit on that pick, I think they are really well. And I think Kyle Shanahan's a better coach than McVay as well.
I do too. Everyone's like, McVay's got the photographic memory. And I'm like, all right, cool. He scored 3 points in the Super Bowl against a fairly underwhelming Patriots team, at least as far as Patriot teams that I remember over my entire time watching that team. And San Francisco, the way that they're going about it, I wonder if this is something that more teams try to emulate, where, all right, we've talked about how you gotta win with a quarterback on a rookie contract. Well, maybe the next step is you get a decent team with a decent quarterback. You put together, and San Francisco's been so lucky with all these top 10 picks that they've had, and they've actually worked out, although maybe not Solomon Thomas as much. But do you get to a point where you're like Kansas City in that you have an average quarterback, you feel pretty good about the direction of your team, and then you're like, all right, let's go surprise everybody and trade up for a quarterback and see what happens? Because then all of a sudden, you got the quarterback on the rookie scale, and that does open up a lot of avenues. In Kansas City, it seems like probably not until next year until they're going to have to, I think, really end up having to make some tough decisions, assuming that the salary cap is real, by the way, because I think that's the other thing, too, that we've learned this offseason. Maybe this whole thing is fake. It's just an illusion that the Rams have successfully figured out.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think San Francisco sees themselves as Kansas City probably in 2017, where they have a good team. They can compete. I know a lot of the writers think they have a Super Bowl team, but they obviously see the quarterback position as a limitation. They've been sniffing around guys the whole time. And I think if they do keep Garoppolo, I think it's exactly the Alex Smith-Mahomes transition plan, and see if the quarterback can come in and beat them now. If not, they have a guy they can get to the playoffs with potentially if he stays on the field. He has not been good at that. And I think that's exactly what they molded after, because they probably look back at that first draft, and that was the Mahomes-Watson draft, and they took Solomon Thomas. And Shanahan's shown a pretty good ability over his career to get the most out of relatively mediocre quarterbacks, like dating all the way back to Matt Schaub in Houston.
Yeah.
I know that as well as anyone. He led the league in passing one year.
It's insane.
I had him in my fantasy team back in the day. And I watched a lot of Houston Texans football in those days, and that was a fun offense with Kubiak
Andre Johnson
and Foster, and You put Kirk Cousins, he had career years, and that was the guy apparently Shanahan wanted when they traded for Garoppolo. And he's got that soft spot for Kirk Cousins. They drafted him in Washington. So he's probably thinking Matt Ryan, MVP. So you get someone in their system who's functional and they could take off.
We touched on Kansas City just a moment ago. That's where Jarran Reed went. How much do you think they're going to miss Jarran Reed? Part of me looks at Jarran Reed, and I'm frustrated that I never saw this 2018 version of Jarran Reed. I started covering the team in 2019, and of course he suspended the first 6 games, and he comes back, and there ankle injury and all sorts of other things. There's a lot of excuses given for his play. I never noticed him. And even though he had 6.5 sacks this past season, I'm not going to act like losing him isn't a loss. It's a step back. But I thought I would notice him a little bit more, and we went back and talking about that contract that they gave him. I still don't get that contract. I mean, of all the things that the Seahawks have done probably in the time that I've been here, the Jarran Reed contract makes no sense to me still.
No, it struck me as a weird, desperate decision where it was hard to see who they were bidding up against. And you're right. And the thing that with Jarran Reed, when he came out of Alabama, he was never this pass rushing defensive tackle. That's not what he was known for. He was more of a well-rounded, set the line kind of player. And he seemed to have his 2 best seasons when edge pass rushers were taking all the pressure and he would take advantage of it. He had Frank Clark the one year before he got here. And then you had, once Dunlap got there last year, he sort of spiked at the end of the year. But in Kansas City, he's in a role that fits him. He's the 3rd pass rusher on the line. He's not a guy, he's not going to make very much money. That's sort of what Jarran Reed is. And Seattle was paying him to be an elite disruptor. They got little value out of that contract, and he's not a $13 million player. And we were talking for weeks in our little Real Hawk Talk chat thing where I'm like, this Jarran Reed contract just jumps off the page to me. The suppressed cap, and he's getting $13.5 million. I thought a trade was possible, but the more I looked into it, it was just like they were going to get rid of him. It didn't add up. And he's just, I said before, you can't pay average players elite money. It kills you. And that was a deal that blew up after 1 year.
This is Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter. So this is the part of the show, Jeff, where we figure out how the heck you got on Seahawks Twitter. So what started your journey down the road where now you're hosting Real Hawk Talk with episode 150, right? Coming up on Wednesday.
So, yeah, I have a sort of unique background probably compared to most people you talk to. I was a sports writer, and I'm from Toronto. So Toronto's a little different than what you guys are used to in the States. In Toronto, football is an afterthought. Like, we don't have a team here. If you ask 12 of my friends, they're 12 fans of 12 different teams. So in Toronto, in this media, what moves the needle is hockey. And for you guys, it's the inverse of what you guys are used to. Like, hockey is football and football is hockey. And I'm not a huge, I grew up playing it. I like it, but for me, it always, so I was always my role and my job was similar to what Brady Henderson did initially at your station. I was covering teams, but I wasn't really there every day. I was sort of writing stories off radio hits, and I worked for a media company that we own the Blue Jays.
Oh, Rogers?
Yeah, Rogers. So I worked at Rogers Sportsnet. And so from Twitter, people could tell I was a Seahawks fan, and I got to cover their Toronto. Remember, Seahawks had a game in Toronto.
Yeah, it was against Buffalo. I'm assuming against Buffalo.
So I got to cover that, and I got to talk to a bunch of the players, and so I got to know people through there, and then just from tweeting. And I got in touch with Brian Nemhauser, and he asked me to come work for his blog because we and him got to know each other through the internet. And my contract at Rogers said I couldn't. Oh. And they're a media conglomerate. They're sort of very protective. They own the team. So it's a weird relationship where you can't be critical of teams. And so I couldn't do work at any other entity. So I had to say no. And then for reasons I don't need to get into here, I ended up leaving that job. And me and Brian connected back a year later. And I wrote him we should start a podcast. There's not a lot of Seahawks podcasts for this crazy Twitter world. He's like, I don't know. I'm just why don't we give it a try, see what happens? So we did. It wasn't very good at first. We're trying different systems. So funny, our first show, we had Seth Wickersham on, and right after that article.
Wow.
It was a pretty good getting. We got Mike Garofalo on our first season, and but other than that, it was kind of like a trial and error thing. And then Brian sort of took over. He's more like the mastermind. He added Evan. He added Nathan Ernst. We've had other guys on. We had Cable Thanos on.
Yeah.
So it's really grown over the year. We're on like episode 150 now, and we've had a lot of people on there, and it's just crazy how it just took off the last 4 years out of nowhere.
All you got to do is start it for anyone else who's out there watching. But yeah, I think you guys have done a fantastic job, and it's great that you have a rotated cast of characters and even Evan Hill in there, who I like. One last question, and this has been the challenge for everybody. You have to describe Seahawks Twitter in one word. Eventually, there will be a fancy montage with all of these people that are saying Seahawks Twitter in one word. We've gotten a lot of different ones. Now that now that you have had sufficient time to think about how to put it into one word, Jeff Simmons, to describe Seahawks Twitter. Your word is?
Go maniacal.
I like that one.
They're probably too smart for their own good. But it's just, there's so many quirky characters, and you have guys who have you have Mina and Danny Kelly who have taken off and become like national personalities. And then you got like a guy like Ben Baldwin who's got I see you getting into it with him sometimes. I don't always agree.
I like Ben a lot. He's see, Ben and I see eye to eye. The funny thing is, though, there are certain things, and this James Harden thing that's going on with Mina Kimes and Ben Baldwin. I'm like, what are you guys doing? I cover this guy. But you know what? James Harden's not in my life anymore, so I probably need to just put that one to rest. But yeah, Ben's great. It is amazing though the different places that whether it's you in Toronto or Mina, who has a background in just a totally different field than this, and the same thing with Danny Kelly and how everything is blown up. It is really cool.
Yeah, and just the cool thing about it is Ben is another one. Me and him don't always agree, but I think I've learned probably more about just a different way to look at things.
Yeah.
Than anything else, because he's really consistent in his beliefs. And again, I don't always agree with them. I think sometimes he's a little much in some of his takes, but he looks at things very differently than I do, and I've probably learned more from him than anyone else. I don't want to tell him that because he'll get it to his head.
We're going to isolate this and send it to him.
Maybe cut this out. But just I see different perspectives, like Evan, who's crazy in many ways. Evan knows a ton about the salary cap. And I've learned more about what a void contract and how you lower a salary cap from Evan than I would. We have guys on our show. We have Nathan and Derek who are very analytically driven. I don't see things like that. My dad was a sports writer. I grew up in the sports industry. I'm more of I've been around these guys. I'm pretty good. I can see things in a game that maybe if someone watched the same game, they go more to the analytical stats, and I more go to, I wouldn't say the eye test. I look at both, but I can see things I think others may not see. Or I'm more become the boring balance. Here's some perspective. It's not the most fun take, but I think the thing I like about Seahawks Twitter, while they are too smart for their own good and they've probably taken away some of their enjoyment out of a pretty good team, they're crazy, and they're crazy in a fun way. And I like that, you get these cast of characters. If you can put a front office together of all of Seahawks Twitter, you would get guys who would do completely different things. You would get the analytics team, the cap team, the college scouting team, and all these little characters make up a crazy community. So it's funny. I went out to Seattle in 2019, and I ended up actually staying at Brian's house. And we went to see the Seahawks Ravens game. I was a big Earl Thomas guy. He got us tickets, whatever. I remember trying to explain to my girlfriend at the time how I knew him.
I met him online.
Yeah, I'm these are my friends online. She's I think you're going to get killed. And there was a picture of 9 of us at one of the bars before the game, Seahawks Twitter in real life. And there was a bunch of guys I'd never met, and we all had beers. It was fun, but trying to explain that to my friends here, we're you host a Seahawks podcast in Toronto. That'd be you hosting a Philadelphia Phillies podcast. That wouldn't make any sense to anyone.
That would be strange.
So you host that. Well, what? It doesn't it. So it's really hard to explain, but the world I'm in, it's a lot of fun. And we have this community now with our show and our podcast that just takes off. I got recognized in Seattle.
That's awesome.
It was so odd. And it's just it's so hard to explain to my friends here and my family here what I'm doing, but the whole community is pretty fun. And like, even though I disagree with a lot of people a lot, because I'm more of a balanced fan, I try to offer the perspective that people seem to miss with it's like politics now. It's like you're on one complete side of the issue and you don't see the other side, and that's it. That's all you can frame your arguments. So it's just fun to just like get to know everyone. And these shows are fun because you just see different sides of people that the people that are just always yelling online.
It is funny to get all the actual words as opposed to being just keyboards and 280 or less. But yeah, I'm with you. It's great that all these different perspectives, they kind of all come together. And yeah, there's definitely friction, but the friction is quite amusing. Jeff, this was a pleasure. At Real Jeff Simmons, make sure that you check out every single episode of Real Hawk Talk. Congratulations on episode 150. That is a very, very cool accomplishment, and I'm sure that you guys are going to be talking a lot about Tyler Lockett on this Wednesday night show as we record this on Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's still pretty mind-blowing to me. Like, we have people from Brazil and people from across the world who will write us and be like, we stayed up late to watch your show, and like, I can't comprehend that still. It's still pretty mind-blowing to me, but like, it's fun. I guess people are into this team. I don't know what it is about the NFL compared to other sports. It's just like, you're not going to find another sport where Gabe Jackson restructuring his contract. Like, there's no equivalent to that in baseball or football, or basketball, where that is something, and that opens up a whole conversation. So football is just fun to follow. That's why I'm so into it, because I covered the other three major sports. That's where Toronto has teams. And I was always like, I kind of like the NFL.
Same.
It just didn't move the needle where I live. And that's probably hard for your audience to understand. And it drove me nuts. I tried everything. But so, yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Well, this was a lot of fun too, Jeff. Let's do it again. And thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter.
Anytime. I'm always down.